Good afternoon, everyone. It brings me immense joy to extend a warm welcome to each one of you for another enriching session of ICS Wednesday seminar. My name is Amit Dogra, and I am a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, and I am honored to serve as the master of ceremony for today's event. I extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you who has joined us. The title for today's seminar is Issues and Factors Shaping Chinese Research on Indian Literature. India and China are two of the world's ancient civilizations. As they evolved with their unique characteristics, these civilizations have also learned from and enriched each other through cultural interaction over the centuries. Literature and art was one of the realms in which there was significant and sustained interaction. The interest of Chinese scholars continued well into the modern period and beyond, though perhaps with uneven intensity from one period to another. In first few decades after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, there were a series of political movements that had a great impact on China's attitude towards foreign cultures and its policies towards translation and publication of foreign literature, including Indian literature. India China relations also went through ups and downs due to China's domestic and international compulsions, as well as factors directly related to India China bilateral relations. The seminar will enumerate these factors and analyze how they influenced research on Indian literature in China over the decades since the establishment of diplomatic relations between the two Asian giants. The speaker for today is Dr. Bihu Ghosh, who is currently working as an assistant professor at the Department of East Asian Studies in University of Delhi. She has been trained in Chinese language, literature, and culture from the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She was awarded a doctoral degree in 2019 for her thesis on research on Indian literature in China, individual scholarship, and institution building from 1950 to 2010. She has made presentations in many national and international seminars, conferences, and has also published papers on Chinese literature and culture in edited volumes and in journals such as Viswabharati Quarterly. Chairing today's session is Professor Madhavi Thampi, who is an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies and former editor of China Report. She was an associate professor at the Department of East Asian Studies at University of Delhi, where she taught Chinese history. Her publication include the monograph titled Indians in China from 1800 to 1949. She has also co-authored Narratives of Asia from India, Japan, and China, as well as a book titled China and the Making of Bombay. She edited the volume India and China in the Colonial World. Before I hand over to Professor Thampi, I would request all participants to adhere to some housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to remain muted during the presentation. You may post your questions in the chat box. Alternatively, you may use the raise hand option during the interactive session. After the presentation, you will be called upon to unmute yourself and ask questions. Please remember to mention your name and affiliation while posting your question. I now hand over the floor to the chair to take proceedings forward. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Amit, and good afternoon, everybody. I just want to say that I'm very happy to participate in this program because Dr. Bihu Ghosh is really, I would say, the expert on this subject. She has spent many years researching, Chinese research on Indian literature, and so she'll have a lot to say, and I hope there will be a lot of questions and comments when she's through. So without any further ado, I think I'll hand over to you, Bihu. Please go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your kind words. And I thank you, ICS, for giving me this opportunity to share my work. The introduction has already been given, and since the time is limited, I'll just jump into my presentation. So the topic for today is issues and factors shaping Chinese research on Indian literature. India and China are two of the world's ancient civilizations. In the course of growing with their own unique characteristics, these civilizations have also learned from and enriched each other through cultural interactions over thousands of years. One of the realms in which there has been significant and sustained interactions was literature and art. with the interest of Chinese scholars in Indian literature continuing well into the modern period and beyond, though perhaps with uneven intensity from one period to the other. As is well known, after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, there was a series of political movements launched during the first few decades that had a great impact on China's attitude towards foreign cultures and its policies towards translations and publications of foreign literature, including Indian literature. India-China relations also went through ups and downs due to China's domestic and international compulsions, as well as factors directly related to India-China bilateral relations. The reason for choosing this period between the period between 1950 and 2010 is that the 20th century was important and eventful for both India and China. Since the end of the 19th century, India and China had developed a kind of bond based on nationalist and anti-imperialistic feelings that they shared during the Western colonization period. With memories of the Buddhist period, both countries were now motivated to rebuild old friendly ties and learn from one another. This process of trying to learn each other's culture and trying to find commonalities and differences while learning to coexist are also very important aspects of cultural interaction. Can we go to the next slide, please? Even though there have been exchanges between India and China for over 2,000 years, there was a difference in the ways in which the two cultures looked at each other in the different periods. There is a lot of evidence to show that interactions between the two sides in the earlier period has mostly been driven by Buddhism. Research of Indian literature was predominantly confined to translation of sutras and perhaps the explanatory treatises. During the period between the 10th and the 17th century, Buddhism had more or less blended into the Chinese social fabric, but there was a sharp decline in the pilgrimages to India. New ties were now being formed based on trade and commerce. In the modern period, from the 18th century to 1950, new relations began to be forged between India and China. China began to look towards India with a new attitude as relations based on nationalism and anti-imperialist feelings began to develop. The view of the scholars also widened to other areas like translation of classical works of Indian literature, like the Vedas or the epic sagas. Rabindranath Tagore grew as a major figure of interest and became a symbol that could forge the solidarity of the colonized cultures. The most significant fact about the period or the development of research on Indian literature in China during this period is that it developed through the years because of a collective effort of a large number of scholars. Scholars like Qi Xianlin, Jin Kemu, who established the programs around the late 1940s, not only taught their own courses, but also produced a large body of books and research articles to develop interest and awareness about Indian literature in China. At the Department of Oriental Languages and Literature, Peking University, Qi Xianlin and Jin Kemu taught their first batch of Indologists in China, including later big names like Liu Anwu, Jin Dinghan, Huang Baosheng, Shui Kejiao, Wang Xun, Yu Longyu, and others, who in turn continued to research on India and also to teach new generations of students across China. These scholars worked steadily on translation and research projects focusing on various aspects of Indian literature and culture. It was a joint effort and dedication of the scholars of this period and of the three generations since 1950 that has led to a very strong research base of Indian literature in China. The next slide, please. This presentation is an effort to analyze the socio-political backdrop of China and look for issues and factors that shaped research on Indian literature in China during the period of 1950 and 2010. To this end, the two major threads of this presentation are one, China's socio-political backdrop and the literary artistic scene, and two, the India-China relations, which includes both the India-China political relations as well as the cultural exchanges during this period. So I'm looking at both these threads simultaneously in the broad phases of broad period of first the Mao period, and then the early reform and Tang period, and after that the post Tang or the deepening of reform period. Next slide, please. Okay, so there has always been a connection between the literary works produced and the socio-political situation in China in the 20th century. Since the establishment of the PRC, the policies of the CPC have determined the boundaries of literary creativity and publications. However, the degree of control has varied through the years, depending on the political situation and the mood of China at the time. If we look at China during the Mao period, during the entire Mao Zedong reign, the literature saw a lot of ups and downs in China. Scholars and writers had to toe a very thin line to produce works as requested or as needed by the party. The thought reform movement was directed primarily towards the intellectuals. It was one of the three campaigns carried out in 1951 to 52 to strike on undesirable elements of the urban society. It had begun with the rectification drive in Yan'an in the year 1942 and continued to be a distinctive means of social, political, and ideological control. Yan'an talks had come to constitute the foundation of the party state's official policy on literature and art, which defined the social political responsibilities of intellectuals. And with the talks at the core, new literature began to come up with themes that were approved by the party. Next slide, please. So through the 1950s, there were a series of campaigns that tried to guide the literary creativity, like I've listed them here: the 100 Flowers movement, anti-rightist movement, and so on, till the Cultural Revolution in the fall of 1965, which was a full-scale campaign of unprecedented ferocity. Creativity in literature and art almost came to a standstill. Next slide, please. The interactions between India and China through the 1950s had its basis in the newly emerging post-war world order, where the third world countries were quite keen to cooperate and consolidate an alternative power bloc. After PRC was established in 1949, Indian Prime Minister Nehru proposed exchange of diplomatic missions between the two countries. New Delhi's basic foreign policy was to preserve peace and not be aligned with any power bloc. At the same time, India, with 2,500 miles of border with China, did not want to antagonize China. On the other hand, PRC was also quite aware of the advantages to be gained by remaining on good terms with India. Next slide, please. Since the establishment of diplomatic relations between the two countries, there have been frequent state visits on both sides, resulting in deepening of mutual understanding, promotion of bilateral relations, and overall strengthening in India-China friendship. For instance, in June 1954, Zhou Enlai, Premier of the Government Administration Council then, and now the State Council of the PRC, visited India for the first time. He and Prime Minister Nehru issued a joint statement that elaborated their vision of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence as the framework of India-China relations. However, relations started deteriorated after the border clash between India and China in 1962, following which exchanges virtually came to a standstill during the 10-year period of domestic unrest in China during the Cultural Revolution. Next slide. After the Buddhist period of extraordinary cultural and literary exchanges, many scholars considered the period of 1950s as another significant period for Indian literature in China. In fact, during the 1950s until India-China relations started to deteriorate in the 1960s, there was an unprecedented active literary interaction between the two countries. several delegations of writers and cultural practitioners were exchanged on a regular basis, which not only facilitated the exchange of ideas but also established long-term literary partnerships. Yet, a close analysis reveals that the reception of Indian literature in China in the 1950s was also nuanced, and reception of a certain type of work was subject to overall socio-political environment of China. But through the 1950s, a large number of Indian works were translated into Chinese. The environment in China was in favor of academic exchanges with India, and a great amount of literary works were being produced as a result. Sanskrit works like Shakuntala, Meghduta, Nagananda, Panchatantra were translated along with well-known English, Hindi, Bengali literature that included works of Mulk Raj Anand, Premchand, Sharat Chandra Chatterjee, and others. Tagore, who had been constantly translated and had been a subject of academic research in China since he received his Nobel Prize in 1913, continued to be translated through the 1950s. However, it was not just famous writers. There were also a lot of works on Buddhist and Indian philosophy, art, history, politics of India, etc. Pioneers of this area, Qi Lin, wrote several books and papers on history and literature of India, the India-China cultural exchanges, etc. So Chinkamu also, he wrote on the history of Sanskrit literature, which later became a textbook for students of India studies at Peking University. Qi Lin and Chinkamu trained a number of Sanskrit students like Huang Baosheng, Zhao Pohua, Wang Bangwei, and others, who went on to become the second generation of renowned Sanskrit scholars of China. During the late 1940s and 1950s, there was an interest in translating works like Ramayana, Mahabharata, Puran, etc. Among the students. China's age-old interest in Buddhism also led to an interest in works like Jataka tales in the modern times. On the whole, China produced a large number of translations of Indian works during this period for the Chinese readership. Over 100 literary works were translated from 1950 to 1985, and 59 of those were published in the 50s itself. However, the border clash and the 10 years of cultural revolution that followed disrupted the friendly interactions between the two countries. Next slide, please. Post-62 work on Indian literature was infrequent and of a certain type that conformed to the political mood of China. During the Cultural Revolution, even celebrated scholars like Qi Lin were targeted and were not allowed to engage in any kind of academic work. China had completely shut down academic contact with India along with the rest of the world. However, some works were still published in the area of Indian literature during the period of 1963 and 76, like the works I have listed here in the PPT. Next slide, please. Through the 1950s, the two countries also engaged in intense and vigorous political, economic, and cultural exchanges and cooperation. The China-India Friendship Association and the India-China Friendship Association was established in 1951 and 1952, respectively. Their contributions towards India-China cultural exchanges were immense. China-India Friendship Association was to become the division of China and the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, that is the CPA-FFC. It promoted long-term exchanges between the people of the two countries in accordance with the state of the political relations between the two governments. Over the years, this continued through the reform period. The CPA-FFC organized several events and meetings, such as exchange visits by delegations, commemoration activities, and even conferences and forums were hosted for the purpose of development of India-China relations. Next slide, please. Okay, so coming to the next period, that is the period of economic reform and opening up, that is the early reform, post-Mao period and the Tang period. Damages made during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution had plunged the country into chaos. The giant task of bringing order in China now rested with Deng Xiaoping. He believed that the larger fault lay in the system and decided to open up China's doors to new ideas from around the world. He encouraged officials to learn from different parts of the world, expanded opportunities for young talents to receive better training, raised the standard for scholars. The new leadership was now aware that the drive for economic development and modernization, that if the drive for economic development and modernization was to be successful, the cooperation of the intellectuals was necessary. China opened its door to foreign literature and impressed upon the importance of learning from foreign wisdom. The policies of reforms and opening up was initiated in 1978. Deng Xiaoping had announced that he wanted to increase the number of students going abroad by the thousands. And between 1978 and 2010, more than 1 million Chinese students went abroad for education. Scholars were asked to collect textbooks from abroad and update their teaching materials. Deng Xiaoping also encouraged translation of foreign works into Chinese on a large scale. Chinese intellectuals once again started to look outside their borders with an open mind and interest towards new ideas. Next slide, please. India-China relations picked up again in the 1970s and early 80s. When Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's state visit to China in 1998 was a historic meeting with Deng Xiaoping, and it marked the milestone in India-China relations as the beginning of normalization of relations between the two countries. Following Rajiv Gandhi's visit, India and China entered a new era of dialogue and communications. Next slide, please. Okay, so during this period, more and more foreign works were now being commissioned to be translated into Chinese and made available to the people. Almost 300 plus publishing houses across the country, like foreign language press based in Beijing, were now involved in publishing translated works. Not that this period was devoid of party or state intervention, it was, however, devoid of the radicalism and the mass mobilization that featured in the campaigns earlier. In such a comparatively relaxed environment of 1980s, there was a renewed endorsement of contact and interaction with foreign ideas and concepts. Translation and research of foreign literature entered a new phase of recovery in China. As India-China relations began to move towards normalization, it also primed for an expanded and extensive period of research on Indian literature in China. Over 300 Indian literary works were published in China during the 1980s and the 90s. As there was more endorsement to learn new languages, the highlight of this period was that a lot of these works were translated from original versions rather than the English or the Russian versions, as was the case before. Authors and writers other than Rabindranath Tagore or Premchand were also introduced and appreciated in China, especially Indian English authors like Mulkraj Anand, R. K. Narayanan, etc. However, Tagore still maintained his position of being the most read and researched Indian literary figure in China. Next slide. I think there is a... okay, so yeah. So the main difference now from the work done in the 50s can be summed up as, for one, not only huge works, but also many single chapters were being translated and introduced. Fewer works were being translated indirectly from English and Russian, and there was more direct translations from Sanskrit, Pali, Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, and Tamil. Not only poetry, drama, and novels, etc., but even literary theories and history of literature, etc., were also being translated. More and more new writers and their works were being introduced to China through translations. From the end of the Cultural Revolution up till 2010, more than 1,200 books in the field of Indology and India studies had been published in China. Next slide, please. Tang was succeeded by Jiang Zemin, and who followed in his footsteps and continued to consolidate and implement his domestic and international policies after him. Hu Jintao, after him, also worked towards improving domestic and international situation through policies aiming at building a harmonious society or a harmonious world, and in the process consolidated China's place on the international platform. State visits, delegations for exchanges between India and China continued during this period, as you can see here, and each visit aimed at resolving and improving relations. Next slide, please. A highlight in the area of foreign literature was that Indian English literary works, especially those that won international awards, were immediately translated into Chinese. This was because the Chinese scholars, especially those who engage in foreign literature studies, were always on the lookout for trends or exceptional works around the world. For instance, like you can see the examples here, Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things was translated the same year as it was awarded. The Inheritance of Loss by Kiran Desai was translated within 2 years of its publication. The White Tiger was also translated within 2 years of being awarded. So to conclude, I'll just wrap it up. I'll just try to conclude quickly. The research of Indian literature in China has been shaped by factors such as China's domestic socio-political environment and her policies towards literary production and role of literature, and finally by the ups and downs of India-China relations. The Mao period saw a number of political campaigns that had a direct or indirect impact on intellectual freedom and also on literary production. We can safely say that India-China interactions in each phase in history has had different flavors and thus has influenced the interest in research of Indian literature differently. After the 1950s, after 1950, the first decade was high on mutual interest and exchange forged in the foreground of India-China friendship and the Third World solidarity. India-China relations, China's relation with India was friendly through the 1950s. There were regular political, cultural, and literary interactions which favored the growth of literary works on India. Works on Indian literature were appreciated and saw high point during the 1950s. The introduction of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence in 1954 was one of the most important political alliances that came to guide all future India-China interactions. However, the 1962 border clash began to taint friendly relations and led to decrease in exchanges. And the 10 years of Cultural Revolution after that, from 66 to 76, did more damage. Following the death of Mao Zedong and the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976, Deng Xiaoping's plans for revitalizing China started with opening China's doors to the outside world. The policies introduced by him in the reform period resulted in a more relaxed environment for literary production, and there was more creativity and tolerance in the intellectual sphere. Deng Xiaoping encouraged and accepted foreign ideas and concepts. He sent thousands of students to study abroad with the purpose of bringing home new information, ideas, technology, and new literature. This implied that research on Indian literature in China also picked up again and grew in leaps and bounds. Bilateral relations began to normalize in the late 1970s. Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's visit in 1988 was a milestone towards improving relations between the two countries. Since then, Indian and Chinese leaders have undertook official bilateral visits regularly and carried out negotiations on unresolved issues and emerging issues of common concern. The reform period was significant as it saw regular exchanges of students, delegations, artists, and writers, etc. Such interactions spurred the cultural exchanges and proved to be an impetus for research on each other's literature and art. Research of Indian literature entered a new phase, a new height in China in the 1980s, when the interest, scope, and attitude towards Indian literature expanded significantly. More and more Indian authors were now being translated into Chinese. Along with translation of literature, there was now a significant, now a more systematic research on Indian literary work and theories. Moreover, many Indian regional languages started being taught and translated in China. Through the 1950s to 2010, this period, Indian literature in China has been strengthened by the scholars of several generations. The giants, such as Qi Xianlin, Qin Kemu, they laid the foundation for research in different aspects of Indian culture. These scholars not only produced several important works that served as tools for, but also served as tools for teaching the later generations, but they also themselves trained and mentored a large number of scholars like Liu Anwu, Huang Baosheng, Qin Dinghan, etc., who consolidated their research and worked hard towards developing interest in Indian literature in China. For instance, Qi Xianlin, Qin Kemu, Huang Baosheng, and others, they built a Sanskrit research core in China, which produced a lot of work and reintroduced ancient Indian literature to China. Owing to China's age-old fascination with Buddhism, research on ancient Indian literature excited a lot of scholars through this period, and a substantial body of work was produced in the area. The Department of Hindi Studies at Peking University, initiated by Qin Kemu, also produced a number of scholars who have translated many Hindi literary works into Chinese. Liu Anu, for instance, Liu Anu has produced a remarkable number of translations in the area of Hindi literature. He has also trained a large number of scholars like Shui Keqiao, Wang Shuying, Yu Longyu, Jiang Jinghui, etc., who too have made a mark in their respective areas. The development of research on Indian literature in China began from almost nothing concrete and developed through these years because of the collective effort of a large number of scholars. Generations of scholars worked steadily on translation and research projects focusing on certain aspects of Indian literature and culture. Like Qi Xianlin taught Wang Bangwei, who in turn taught Chen Ming in ancient Indian literature, and more specifically Buddhist literature. They actually, so there are basically 3 generations of scholars who have engaged in Buddhist literature. It is a joint effort and dedication of scholars of the past and of the 3 generations since 1950, and that has led to a strong research base of Indian literature in China. India studies, especially Indian culture studies, as a multidisciplinary area of knowledge, had begun with Peking University in China, and gradually, not only the number of scholars interested in the research of India increased, but trained scholars also spread all over the country, leading to the emergence of new institutes and developments of India studies all over the country. For instance, Yu Longyu, who is a product who was taught in Peking University, moved on to Shenzhen University, where he started his own department of India studies. I think I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bihu. It's you have really done a very comprehensive and competent study of what drives Chinese research into Indian literature, as well as the, I would say, not just the issues and factors, but also the institutional structure which facilitates this. You've made a number of important points, I think. One is that I think if I'm correct, you've identified like the 1950s as well as the early reform period, 80s and 90s, as periods of great productivity in Chinese research into Indian literature. And you have connected it with both the domestic factors in China domestic socio-political factors as well as vicissitudes in India-China relations. So I think that's, your one of your main thesis, and which you have shown. You have also, identified several generations of scholars, as you call them, or three generations in particular. And you have said how they have actually sort of one has nurtured the other, and then they have worked together actually in collaborative works, which has contributed to what I would really say is a very substantial body of work on Indian literature. I mean, there are not too many other parallels, I would say. There are some in the Western world, but the Chinese research into Indian literature is really quite substantial. You've also identified what have been the main areas of interest. First, classical Indian literature, Sanskrit literature, which is understandable given the long history of relations based on Buddhism. But apart from that, I would say, Tagore studies, and then Hindi literature, and more recently, Indian English literature, which is an interesting new phase, as well as I think you mentioned that now there is translation directly from regional literature, Indian regional literature into Chinese. And also you have talked about the institutional framework, the universities, the institutes, as well as the delegations that were involved in. So I think altogether this amounts to a very comprehensive picture, and I would encourage the audience here to think of their questions and post them in the chat box, or else raise your hand. But before that, maybe I'll just start off by asking you one question, which is really what accounts for this fascination with Tagore in China? I mean, in India, yes, Tagore is definitely up there. And, maybe even more so, I would say, in Bengal, but generally all over India. But this continuing, persistent fascination right down to the present day with Tagore in China, what do you attribute it to? And, would you link it with the fact that of his international recognition? I mean, are the Chinese, more drawn to Indian literature, which has an international audience? I mean, is that the case, or is it something else? I would like to know your opinion on that. Meanwhile, please, others, raise your questions.
Ma'am, I'll start with you with your question itself. I think Tagore, the body of research that has formed on Tagore, yes, it has started since his Nobel Prize in 1913, and how he kind of grew as an international figure. That is definitely one of the main reasons why China started looking at India with Tagore and his international presence, and that he broke the Western dominance and got the Nobel Prize. And so he's pretty much looked at as an idol, or that's why he's an inspiration even to the Chinese people. And the body of research has only grown since then. I mean, it has seen its ups and downs, because even Tagore works has seen there were certain works which were not allowed in China because of the current or the environment of China at the time, which was not allowing for some of Tagore's ideas to be introduced into China at a period of time. But even then, I mean, today Tagore is an author or a writer who has been, I think all of Tagore works have been translated once or more than once in China. And actually, I also posed this question to some of the scholars that I had interviewed during my my field trip to China, when I was interviewing a lot of the Indologists and the scholars. And they all said the same thing, that Tagore has an international presence, and it has political and international significance, because because of his stature on the international platform. So that's why that is one of the main reasons why Tagore has always got China's attention, I think.
But would you say that, okay, that's one thing, his, the international stature, and as you say, he broke the Western dominance of that Nobel Prize for Literature. But other than that, is there something in his imagery or in the themes of his poetry and other writings that speak to Chinese readers? Would you say that something in the content of what, which would account for this like continuing bond? Because after all, he won the Nobel Prize back in more than 100 years ago, but still there is a lot of a lot of water has flowed under the bridge in the meantime. Is it? But for even today, there to be so much interest and multiple translations. Have you found that there's something in his themes or the images that that appeals particularly, because it's nothing, there's no connection with Buddhism or anything like that. So I just would like you to sort of speak freely about that, if you think there is something more than
what I have read till now is I have not really seen whether there's been particular themes which have interested the Chinese scholars, but I do see that a lot of the Chinese scholars seem to be inspired by him, or his writing style. So scholars like the Komoro, for example, and Pingxing, for example, they say that they already admit that their works are inspired, or their style of work is inspired by Tagore. But I don't know if that is because of the theme that he writes on, or just the way he writes.
Okay, all right, thank you. We have a question from Rapai. He says, do you think the recent exchange of students between the two countries affected the knowledge of literature society in any serious way? The recent exchange, by that, do you mean currently the back and forth, Rapai, or would you like to come in yourself?
Yeah, starting with 2000 or around that time, apart from the exchange students, the students studying medicine and other purposes, more tourists and more opportunities for students. Maybe from China, we didn't get that much, but a lot of Indian students started going to China.
Okay.
So if Bigu interviewed,
can you please repeat the question once?
Yeah, Rapai, just state your question again.
Yeah, question I want to know, because Bigu researched into it and she met the people. What is her impression about the people recently traveled between, especially students who stayed, say, 6 months, more than 6 months in China, or the students came and stayed in. I'm not talking about tourists, because tourists may not pick up about or talk about literature, but students certainly have some interest in looking at the literature or things like this.
So you're asking if there's been a change in the way the students
change, or at least some movement in the knowing little more about literature.
You're asking me if there's more interest on knowing about India, is it?
Knowing about India, as well as Indians going to China, about China and Chinese literature.
I haven't really looked at that aspect about Indians going to China and what they are looking for, or what is their interest. But yeah, the Chinese people who are looking at India, they seem to initially the literature has actually also helped clear out a lot of misunderstandings about India. And in that case, for instance, Tagore works also has helped clear a lot of misunderstandings about India. Chinese people initially, they all thought that India, since it's the land of Buddhism, so the most prominent religion in India is Buddhism. But that was a misinformation that finally cleared with when they started reading Tagore's works, and they saw that Buddhism is not that popular in India. It's more Hinduism or Islam and everything. So literature actually did help in clearing a lot of misinformation about India and China. And the students who are looking at India now, especially because of Indian English literature, because of the Western influence in China right now, English is already becoming quite popular and quite easy, access in China. So Indian English works also have gained a lot of popularity in China because of that. So a lot of Indian English writers like R.K. Narayanan and others, Mulk Rajanand, they are gaining a lot of popularity in China. So works on these kind of authors are being done. They are being read on a quite large scale.
Because I have seen some of the works getting translated into Malayalam, but it is not that much. Some of our literary supplements started picking up occasionally some Chinese stories, but I don't know how far it will go. But
so you're talking about our work. Are you talking about Indian works being translated to China or Chinese works to India?
I perfectly like your answer. No issue on that. But I think
I'm getting a little confused here.
No, don't get confused. Because I think
she's
in India
asking
also
whether you're talking about Indian literature, Indian translations of Chinese literature or Chinese translations of Indian literature.
No, I think Bigu can talk more about the Chinese side, but I have seen little bit here and there. Of course, you know more about the China report and the stuff you have seen, Mother. Thank you.
Okay, there's another question by Farah who says, you mentioned a significant increase in interest in Indian literature in China during the 18th to the mid-20th century. Could you discuss the factors contributing to this shift?
You mentioned a significant increase in interest in Indian literature in China during the 18th and the mid-20th century. Okay, could you discuss the factors? 18th to the mid-20th century. You talk so the early 1900s, is it?
Yeah, I think so. Assume that.
So in the early before the period of 1950s, there was still actually that's not really my period, but then I do know that there was a lot of intellectuals who were already studying Chinese. There were already a lot of intellectuals who were looking at India and studying 1900s, early 1900s. I think in that period there were. Let's see. Give me a minute. Let me just think about it. I can think about scholars like Xu Fancheng, who were. So at that period, I think it's mostly people who are beginning to study Indian literature. They were going into starting the training of since I'm looking at it as a background of my area of research. I have looked at the scholars who were beginning to study India during that period, the early 1900 period. So there were scholars like Tang Yung Thong. There was Xu Fancheng, who was already starting to study Indian literature, but there were works. They had started to write essays, I think, and there was apart from Tagore during the early 1900s. I think I can't really think of any specific.
If I can just come in here, I think there were two kinds of things going on in terms of the literary China-India literary sphere in the first half of the 20th century. One is that there were Chinese who went abroad and they learned, they did, uh, did train in Sanskrit studies, Buddhist studies abroad.
Yeah.
And, people like Chen Yin-xue and others, right? And then some of them came back also. And so that's one thing that was going on. That is people taking an interest in Sanskrit literature and other things, but trained in the Western universities and then Western methodology of studying, which is different from the earlier era of Chinese study of Buddhist literature. So this is one thing that was going on in the early 20th century. But the second thing, which is where I have a bit of an issue with you, is that there was also a very negative image of India among Chinese intellectuals and writers in the early 20th century. India, which was then still a colony, was seen as a kind of negative example for China. I mean, there are a lot of writing about that now. And in fact, that whole May 4th, generation, there was a lot of very ambivalent feelings about India. So, which was manifested when Tagore came to China, and he met two kinds of reaction there. Those who really admired him, even adulated him, and the others who were very against his coming. So, what I would like to bring out is that the early 20th century, there is really a double kind of thing as far as Chinese attitude towards India is. And so in this connection, what I wanted to ask you is was there any of that residual negative image of India? Was that at all manifested in Chinese studies of Indian literature after the 1950s, from the 1950s on? After all, many of the people who were writing in the 1950s would have been part of that May 4th generation or been very influenced by that May 4th generation. So, but because it seems like I don't get a sense in your talk that there's anything negative. I mean, it is all appreciation only of Indian literature. But what do you, can you respond?
I think if you're talking about the negative reaction of the Chinese scholars towards some negative reaction of the Chinese scholars, what I saw was mostly in that period when the Tagore visit happened in China, the lecture tour that happened in 1924. At that time, yes, because of the environment of China at the time, some of Tagore's works were not taken very well, or not taken in this. They did not seem to suit the environment of China at that time. So a lot of these scholars, even scholars who earlier appreciated Tagore and his works, they started criticizing him, saying that his works are not suitable, or they don't match the Chinese tenor at the time. So some of his works were criticized, and in fact his lecture tour was also dampened. The spirit of the lecture tour was also dampened, but I think Tagore also took it in his stride. He did not. He understood the feelings of these scholars who were at that time trying to, it was that kind of an environment in China at the time. But I think by the end of it, even like, for instance, Home and the World is a very important example in this context, because Home and the World, it was initially published during when Tagore got his Nobel Prize, or at the eve of his the lecture tour in 24. But at that time also, scholars like Chantushu, they really criticized the work. But eventually the work was again commissioned during the 1956 100 Flowers movement era. because that time the environment in China was quite relaxed when it came to literary works. And then again, because the situation changed quickly during the anti-rightist movement, the work was shelved. It was not published at the time. And later on, in the late 80s, it was another translation of Home in the World, which was again a direct translation from Bengali. It's Bengali, and that translation, along with the one that was commissioned previously and shelved, both of them were published. So I think the reception of certain Indian works has seen a negative some kind of criticism also, but eventually at the moment I don't think but still I think even then it has been published later on. So I don't know if that it was a major cause of tension anymore.
Okay, thank you. We have a raised hand now. Would you please go ahead, Chinmay Rahandel?
Yes, ma'am. I'm good morning. Good afternoon. I'm Chinmay Rangdale. I'm PhD scholar at University of Delhi. So, first of all, thank you, Bihu ma'am, for such an informative lecture. So, I would like to ask two questions. My first question is, since both India and China are ancient civilization, and like from what I have seen, there are some commonality in both the can say Chinese and Indian society based on like family structure and all, like how we like previously how generations used to live, like three generations used to live in under one roof, our importance for ancestors and the family structure and everything, respect for elders. So do you think that was the one of the reason why can be the one of the reason why some Chinese scholars were interested in Indian literature, which were somewhat related to society, so that they can also find the commonalities between India and Chinese society? This is my first question. And my second question is, after like you have mostly talked about till 2010 about the literature, Indian literature in China. But if you know that after that Xi Jinping came into power, is there any have there been any change in the cooperation for Chinese literature, Indian literature in China, like on policies level, government level, or if there's been positive growth or a negative? Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think your first question, when you're asking whether the family structure in China and the family structure in India, that there being a similarity has affected literature. But I think it's not just that. I think India and China culturally have a lot of commonalities, and that's why perhaps the literature, when they read stories and when they read works, that they're able to make a connection. I think that yes, that is definitely one of the reasons why the interest in China or interest of China in Indian literature may have grown or may have kept the attention of the Chinese people, because they obviously they do see similarity between the two cultures, and which comes out very clearly in works, in literary works. So yeah, I do think that the commonalities and the similarities between Indian and Chinese cultures have kept Chinese people's attention, and they're probably able to relate with the works better because of these commonalities. And the second question you're asking was whether the cooperation has continued, is it?
Yes, ma'am. The cooperation has continued, and like if there is any more cooperation, like any positive growth in cooperation or the negative.
Yeah, I think the cooperation has more or less increased or at least maintained since, because you see a lot of works on Indian literature happening even now in China. In fact, there have been collaborative works happening between India and China, between the Indian and Chinese literary circles. For instance, the Encyclopedia of India-China Cultural Relations was released in the early 2010s something, and there's also a Chinese version now, which is the India-China dialogue of civilizations. So these kind of works have continued through these years, even post 2010, which does tell me that the relations or the interactions have only gotten better, and at least, if not gotten better, they have at least maintained it in spite of whatever political ups and downs that has been going on.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Alka Acharya would like to ask a question. Alka, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Piyu. It was really nice listening to you. You took us through a nice historical journey, stopping at interesting places, giving us an idea of the terrain. So that was good, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you. Now I'm going to slightly shift the discussion a bit because what I really was trying to um, think about, which your talk has triggered. So it's not immediately directly coming out of your talk, but you see, part of the appeal of Tagore among a range of, I mean, not those who attacked him, as Madhuri was pointing out, there was a negative dimension there as well, but part of the appeal to those who appreciated Tagore and therefore were also inspired to look into Indian writings was his vision of this alternative modernity. Now, I want to know whether Chinese scholars actually took off from there. Did they see Tagore in any way as inspiring some kind of thinking or a new discourse, and especially the East, that quote unquote that Tagore championed? To what extent does it take root, and to what extent does it draw upon Tagore's visions of alternative modernities? Have you read something about it or come across it in your works?
Ma'am, I haven't specifically read about this in too much details, but I think you're right. It was the civilizational dialogue that really interested the Chinese. The Chinese people. Rabindranath Tagore, being an internationalist, he and being one of the most earliest modern thinkers, also drew a lot of attention of the of the Chinese scholars at the time. I think somehow he made them believe that the Eastern civilization had more to offer to the world, and I had more a kind of a better offer for the world. And because in his essays he uses the word of crisis of civilizations, and he's constantly talking about how there has to be more faith in the moral supremacy of the Eastern civilizations. And I think these are the kind of ideas that that attracted the Chinese scholars and intellectuals at the time.
So I guess what I was trying to sort of push you towards is, who are these people, and to what extent do they actually bring Tagore into their writings when they are talking about this? I mean, is it only because we could well have these civilizational kind of notions both in India, China separately? I'm trying to see whether Tagore is a bridge in thinking about these civilizational discourses, or thinking about how India and China together can actually give to the world an alternative vision of modernity.
If I understand correctly, you're asking if works have been influenced by Tagore and his ideas have been, kind of blended into the Chinese works, is it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I think scholars like Komoro and Xie Pingxin, etc., they have admitted that a lot of their works are highly influenced by Tagore, and their works, like for instance Xie Pingxin, she has admitted that her poetry is quite influenced by Tagore. Like her work on, I think it's called Cluster of Stars, Fanxing, I think it is influenced by Tagore's Flying Bird collection and all of that. So I think Tagore works have influenced the works of a lot of scholars, especially Shaping-Shin, Shuichiro, and Komuro, etc. So his ideas are definitely translated into their works, and similar ideas have come out of the Chinese scholarship as well.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I guess where I was taking this to is this a researchable topic? Is this something on which we need to go more
I think so, ma'am, but I haven't really looked at it very in a lot of detail, and I think I should probably take this idea forward.
Definitely. In fact, that's what I think you are in a very good position to now, you have documented this, connection that is there and the research. Now, I would really like to see you go into the influence of Indian literature or on, the Chinese literary discourse. I mean, who else is going to do it? Has to be somebody who has studied, looked at this literature, who knows the basic things. But really, that would be a really big contribution if you can, look into, Tagore, as Alka was suggesting. But apart from Tagore, has there been any, absorption of this, or even in a positive way, negative way, whichever way? But that would really show, I would say, the connection or the literature. And it doesn't matter. You see, that's what I always keep telling. It doesn't matter whether it's positive or negative. We shouldn't be too worried about that, whether. But if there is a reaction, if there's an attempt to understand, to even criticize, but that it would show if there is some impact on the literary field in China. So I really, would second Alka that you should.
Yes, ma'am.
You should go into that.
I should, yeah. No, I think
now you go into stage.
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. This is now I'll take all these comments and all these points, and I can actually work on it.
We work out an area of study that really develops this.
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
and in this connection, I would like to ask you, like, what have you seen of Chinese analysis of Indian writing or criticism of Indian writing? Let's say I'm not starting from the whole period, but let's say a modern, even this more modern writing of Indians, in the Indian English writing, which is getting translated. Have you seen reviews or by Chinese scholars of this kind, any Indian writing, and critical or otherwise? What is it that they say about the Indian writing? I mean, of course, they're translating it, they're looking into it, they're studying it. But what do they have a critical kind of appreciation of Indian writing?
Ma'am, I do know that they write papers, like they write comparative analysis of, different writers, different theories. But I have myself not read those analysis to really make a comment here. But yeah, because what I have done here is basically I have tried to see what are the works that have been done. I haven't been able to yet go into the details of the work as such. So if I choose another specific smaller area, I can go into the details of the works that have been done and how they have analyzed or criticized and such. But at the moment, I just know that they have done a lot of comparative studies, they have done a lot of analysis, criticisms and all of that. But I haven't really gone into the details to be able to tell you what has been their analysis.
Would there be some literary journals like in China which look at foreign literature and which sort of critically look at foreign writing, not just Indian, of course, but what would be the main journals of literary criticism and things in China?
Ma'am, I think Peking University has a journal that comes out, I think, quarterly, which does include a lot of these kind of papers. But I'll go back and check the name and I'll get back to you on that.
Yeah, no, you don't even have to get back to me. We are trying to sort of
have a discourse.
want you to look in certain
Yes, sir.
directions.
Absolutely.
So that would be really interesting. What are they saying about this?
Right.
Because obviously they have to translate it first in order to, or read it in English if it is available. What if they can read the English? But then what are they saying about it? Is it, how critical are they? Anyway, that's just something. Are there any other questions or comments or suggestions? Like we've been making suggestions galore. Okay. If not, then I think
There is one, Madhuri, as I see it, there's one in the chat box.
one more is there. Okay.
Said-
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Musaib Mir. Would you like to ask your question directly? Or anyway, I'll read it out. I want to know if the Chinese intellectual curiosity has been confined only to philosophical and sociological works coming from India, or has China also engaged in trying to understand the classic political treatises and the present body of Marxist and leftist works, which to a very great extent are critical of Indian polity and the way it has managed its international affairs, particularly with China? In other words, do they also look at the Marxist and leftist works, or is it only philosophical and sociological?
Ma'am, I haven't found anything that has looked at Marxist works of India. So, and in any case, I have actually mostly looked at literary works rather than works which have been, political or ideological. So, in my area, I haven't found anything that has got to do that was related to Marxism in India.
Okay. All right. Okay. Anything else? If not, then let us bring these proceedings to a close. Bibhu, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this as much as we enjoyed listening to you, because it's really, every time I see, the kind of study that Chinese have done of Indian literature and culture, I'm always amazed. I mean, there is a substantial body of scholarship on Indian literature, right from the, and as you say, as soon as things come out, even today, they start getting translated if they are well-known works. So it's really good that somebody has studied it here, and I hope you do, don't leave this, but just take it forward and in greater depth, and really get a sense of, in terms of the content, or the literary discourse in China, what is the impact of Indian literature. That would be a really great follow on from this. Okay, so with these words, I thank everybody.
Completely endorse what you just said, Madhuri. Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Bihu. Thank you, ICS. And wish you all the best. Okay? All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I now seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session.
Please, yes. Okay.
With this, we conclude the session and express our gratitude to Dr. Ghosh and Professor Thampi for taking out time out of their busy schedules and sharing their time with us. Today's discussion video will be accessible on ICS YouTube platform. We extend a warm invitation to all for upcoming Gargi and VP Dutt Memorial Lecture on 3rd April 2024 at the India International Center, New Delhi. Details about the event can be found on the ICS website, or you can subscribe to our newsletter